When you look at Japan, its temples, its writing, its traditions, it feels completely unique. But look closer, and you begin to see something surprising. Japan's writing system, its early government, even elements of clothing and religion. Many things began somewhere else, in China. For centuries, Japan looked across the sea to one of the most advanced civilizations in the world and chose what it wanted to adopt. But Japan did not simply copy China, it adapted, refined, and transformed these ideas into something entirely its own. Japan did not always have a writing system. In its early history, there was no native script for recording language, laws, or events. That changed when Chinese characters arrived. These characters, known today as kanji, were adopted and adapted to fit the Japanese language. At first, they were used much like they were in China. Scholars and officials often had to learn Chinese just to read and write. In fact, some of the earliest Japanese records were written entirely in Chinese. But over time, something new began to emerge. Japan modified these characters, blending them with its own sounds and grammar. The result was a layered writing system, part Chinese in origin, yet distinctly Japanese in form. Even today, every written sentence in Japan carries this connection to the past. China also influenced how Japan was governed. During the Tang Dynasty, China developed a powerful and organized state, with laws, officials, and a structured bureaucracy. Japan studied this system closely. Envoys were sent to China to observe how the imperial court functioned, how officials were appointed, how decisions were made, and how order was maintained. These ideas were then brought back to Japan and carefully introduced. Early Japanese rulers adopted court ranks, administrative systems, and even capital city designs inspired by Chinese models. Along with these systems came new ways of thinking, especially Confucian ideas about hierarchy, duty, and social order. But once again, Japan did not follow China exactly. It reshaped these ideas to fit its own traditions and political structure. Even traditional clothing reflects this connection. Early Japanese garments were strongly influenced by Chinese styles. Flowing robes, layered fabrics, and silk designs seen in Chinese courts. During periods of close cultural exchange, these similarities were especially clear. But over time, Japanese clothing began to change. Styles became more refined, more structured, and better suited to local life. What eventually emerged was the kimono, distinctly Japanese, yet rooted in earlier Chinese forms. It is another example of how borrowed ideas were transformed into something new. Religion followed a similar path. Buddhism began in India, but it reached Japan through China. Along the way, Chinese monks and scholars played a key role in shaping how these teachings were understood. They translated texts, developed rituals, and built temples that reflected Chinese artistic traditions. When Buddhism arrived in Japan, it carried this influence with it. Temples, statues, and practices all showed traces of their journey through China. But in Japan, Buddhism continued to evolve, blending with local beliefs and giving rise to new schools and traditions. China had acted as a cultural bridge, passing ideas across Asia, where they took on new life. This shared history can also be seen in architecture. Pagodas, temple layouts, and even early city planning in Japan were inspired by Chinese designs, especially the great Tang capital of Chang'an. Orderly streets, formal layouts, and grand structures reflected this influence. Yet over time, Japanese architecture became more adapted to nature. Simpler, more refined, and closely connected to the surrounding landscape. So how much of Japan's culture began in China? The answer is quite a lot. From Chinese writing and government, to clothing, religion, and architecture. China provided a foundation. But influence is not the same as identity. Over time, Japan selected what it needed, reshaped what it borrowed, and built something that reflected its own values, environment, and way of life. What began as borrowed ideas became something entirely new, and that is what makes Japan's cultural history so remarkable. And here's something worth thinking about. When cultures borrow from each other, where do we draw the line between influence and originality? Which part of Japanese culture do you think shows the strongest connection to China? Let us know in the comments. If you enjoy exploring Asia's history and culture, do subscribe and choose all notifications to get updates about new videos.